where is China going? Well, we don't know exactly where it's going. What we can do is differentiate ourselves from bourgeois mainstream thinking about China. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. 20 or 30 years ago, under Clinton and then Bush minor, the engagement with China from the Western ruling class's point of view was supposed to produce a reformed, transformed China and the end of the Communist Party. The objective was take up where Deng Xiaoping had started the reform process, intensify it, bring China out of isolation and into the World Trade Organization and the American-based, American-led liberal trading system. And this would produce a middle class in China. Economic determinism, this is writ large, produce an economic middle class that would find its voice and depose the Communist Party and deliver China into the arms of the West. And guess what? Today, although we will question this later, the Communist Party is pretty firmly entrenched in power, although I've got something to say about that. And the threats to the American-led liberal trading order don't come from China, they come from America, from Donald Trump. So that approach seemed to me to be based on wishful thinking. And although we as Marxists are optimistic, we're optimistic in the sense of Gramsci's idea of pessimism of the intellect, things look bad, but optimism of the will, we need to keep going. So what I want to say today is, I hope, sober and realistic and not based on wish dreams. I'm not going to claim there's a revolution around the corner in China. I wish there was, but I don't see it just yet. But I do see things happening, unfolding, that are putting more and more pressure on the Chinese ruling class. So what I'll try to do is mobilise a Marxist method, looking at contradictions in the present and social forces beginning to move, and the role of the state that they're moving against in order to address the problems facing China's ruling class. I will focus initially on economic problems, and you'll see that those who followed the Socialist Review monthly magazine in the last year, we've run a series of articles on China dealing with all sorts of aspects of Chinese politics and economics today, from international relations, the initial emergence of a labour movement, some positive signs about an emerging women's movement, problems of the environment and ecology of China. There's a whole series of articles that will be on the stand downstairs of old Socialist Reviews. And I want to try to tie all that together and see what, A, what the problems are, and B, what hopeful signs there are that there may be some radical solutions. So quite a lot of economics, some reference to the emerging labour movement, and then I will, at the end, talk about the politics of the Chinese Communist Party and what seems to be happening. I'm sure most of you are interested in Deng Xiaoping, Xi Jinping, and what he seems to be doing. There's a whole press about this in Western media, about Xi Jinping thought and so on. I will talk about that and conclude. So, firstly, the economy. Well, we hardly need to say that there has been stupendous transformation of the Chinese economy in the last 40 years. I won't say much about that, it's old news now, but I will just make one or two observations of just the scale of the transformation. You see, against the neoliberal argument that the state is a hindrance to economic development and growth, China's proved that mobilising the state alongside private capital, and in many cases controlling private capital, it's been able to transform China. It's got a project called Made in China 2025, right now, to try to forge ahead in a whole range of new technologies, very advanced technologies. They've got a space program, they want to send rockets to the moon, all that sort of thing. Robotics, artificial intelligence, the new quantum net internet, whatever that is. I'm not a scientist, I don't know quite what they're up to. All that is worrying the United States. And it's interesting to see that Trump's tariffs, according to the Financial Times, are largely directed at the industries that are going to be, that are incorporated in Made in China 2025. What have they been able to achieve? Well, let's just give you a flavour. not only 40 odd years, nearly 40 years of more or less 10% growth per year, but on the ground, for instance, 10 years ago, China had no bullet trains, the fast TGV type things, the French version, no bullet trains and no track suitable for them to run on. Since then, it has built more track than the whole of the rest of the world put together. In 2013, in one small poor province, since 2013, it's built more miles of motorway than the entire British motorway network. So that's what, in 5 years. You get a sense of real physical infrastructural transformation. In the year to October 2017, China built more residential, well, as much residential floor space as if they were building Rome every 6 weeks. It's astonishing, the amount of cement that they've used for a start, but the amount of physical infrastructure that's been developed. But Marx argued somewhere that all science would be superfluous if the outward appearance of something coincided with the inner essence. We wouldn't need science, we'd just look at the world. So if we just look at China, we say onwards and upwards, remarkable transformation, and in 5 or 10 years' time it'll be by far the biggest economy in the world, and in 20 years' time we'll have a China-led world order and America will be an also-ran. That's the appearance. But deeper down, hidden behind that appearance, there are some serious contradictions in the Chinese model, and that's now what I want to focus on. Already, if you just peel back the appearance slightly, you can see that for all that remarkable transformation, China remains behind its major economic rivals in many respects. It's deeply uneven, in other words. So, for instance, it has 10 industrial robots per 10,000 workers in China. But there are 100 in America, 300 in Germany and Japan, and over 500 industrial robots per 10,000 workers in Korea, South Korea. So in terms of productivity, it is way behind on average. On average, $20,000 per year value added per worker in China versus 110,000 in America and about 80,000 on average in the EU. Way behind in terms of productivity. Its capital stock per worker is a quarter of that of America's and South Korea's. So even if we only begin to pull back the surface appearance, we see some problems. So let's explore the problems. And the paradox, the first one is, it's overinvested. There's too much investment. And this, if you've seen Joseph Chinara's last article in International Socialism in 158, just a few months ago, he was talking about overinvestment, and he referred to something, classical Marxist argument, about the organic composition of capital. And what that measures, it's a statement from Marx, really, that it's one of the deepest contradictions in capitalism. The more we invest to make productivity increase, the greater the problems become for capital, because dead labour embodied in investment is not the source of profit. It's living labour that's the source of profit. And if we marginalise living labour and overinvest in technologies and machinery and so on, the rate of profit falls. And the overinvestment in China is colossal. Firstly, it's between, on average, 40 to 50% of national income per year. It's moderating downwards slightly, but it's touched 50%, it's now about 43. What does this mean? The corollary is that wages are low as a proportion of national income. Who's going to buy the materials outputted? They go to export largely. So you've got this colossal investment programme. And if Marx is right about the organic composition of capital and the rate of profit, this should be demonstrated in China. And guess what? It is. The second big problem then, apart from overinvestment, is the falling rate of profit. Figures are not absolutely straightforward to come by in the context of China. There's not an openness about those figures. But the Financial Times and The Economist have estimated that the rate of profit for state firms is between 2 and 4%, and for the private sector about 9%, 7 to 9%. These are low rates of profit. So the investment is manifest a bit down the line in a falling rate of profit. And with that in mind, it's not surprising that in 2016, the rate of growth of non-state investment fell to 0. There was no growth in private investment. This is a worrying sign for the Chinese economy. But it pales against the next worrying sign, which is debt. Joseph's article was considerably about debt, and it repays careful reading. Low rates of profit are problematic in the long term, but in the short term, the Chinese ruling class is extremely concerned about debt. The last decade or so, where China's economy has been instrumental in holding back the recession in the global economy, whatever growth there's been has largely been in China. I think, I forget the figure exactly, I think about 3/4 of the world's growth in the last 10 years has come from China. So it's been instrumental in propping up the global economic system. But it's been massively underwritten by debt. In 2008, China turned the taps on to keep the economy going, stimulus package. It was roughly 14% of national income. It made Obama's and Europe's stimulus packages seem minuscule. Move on a few years, and the world's financial press is consistently arguing that there is a Lehman Brothers type crash in the pipeline. There is a bubble about to burst. These sorts of arguments. Okay? And when you look at the figures, you have to say that although there may be a bit of scaremongering about that, we don't know exactly when bubbles burst. Nobody would have predicted probably Lehman Brothers and the Northern Rock a year or a month before it happened. Actually, the figures are really quite astonishing. Corporate debt is 160% of GDP, of national income. It is the world's most indebted corporate sector. Overall debt is somewhere, figures vary, but it's grown from about 250% of national income to about 440% of national income. China is awash with debt. Much of it is in the hands of zombie firms, firms that are only kept up because they have been recipients of loans. They make nothing, they make no profit, essentially. It's been estimated by a respected Chinese banking analyst, Charlene Chu, that the bad debt in China, the underperforming or non-performing debt, is about $8 trillion worth, and that therefore about a third of all debts are underperforming. The official figure from the Chinese state is that 5% of debts are underperforming. Charlene Chu says it's about a third. The area where it's worst is in a sector called shadow banking, and I won't go on about this too much, but it is worth getting a sense of the feelings, of the figures. So, get a sense of the feelings, I suppose, as well. Although shadow banking doesn't elicit much in the way of feelings, but never mind. Well, shadow banking is a global affair, a phenomenon. It's a response to the 2008 crisis when, around the world, central banks tightened regulation to some degree. And the financial sector found ways to squeeze money out from under the regulator's nose into very much more risky operations. Okay? So the Chinese banking sector has these arm's length relationships with rather somewhat dubious shadow banking institutions. And the figures there, again, are absolutely enormous. The sums are estimated at between $8 and $14 trillion. The middle of that, 11, is the one that people normally say, on average, is the shadow banking sector. That is 3/4 of national income. in dubious loans. It's like the Wild West. It's a sort of cowboy approach to economics. People investing in things whose underlying value is virtually zero. And the terrifying thing from China's authorities' point of view is that while it's 75% of GDP today, about $11 trillion, 10 years ago it was zero. It's a very recent phenomenon, and it seems out of control. So much so that the governor of the Bank of China, the central bank governor, has warned of a Minsky moment facing China. It's unusual to hear that level of fear really expressed. What's a Minsky moment? The economist Weyman Bennett argued that the normal operation of capitalism is such that in periods of stability and growth, there is what Greenspan called over-exuberance. Over-exuberance creeps in, and people start making rash decisions and risky decisions, and that then the financial system becomes a risk to the economy as a whole and can set it backwards into recession. And to warn that that is happening potentially in China takes us onto the politics of the situation. What is the state doing? We've looked at debt, we've looked at falling rates of profit, and we've looked at the overinvestment. And it seems to me that Xi Jinping and the small group around him can only really be understood as an early response to what may well be coming in terms of economic crisis and political instability. The first thing to say about the response is, again against neoliberalism and an orthodoxy around globalization theories of various sorts, is that states aren't powerless, and the Chinese state in particular, of course, over the last 40 years has been instrumental in developing China very dramatically. So, just to reinforce that point, in 2008, this massive stimulus package. But now the state has got a problem because it's overstimulated the economy and it needs to somehow deflate the bubble that it, in fact, helped to create. And so for the last couple of years, economic policy, instructed from on high by Xi Jinping and a small group of economic advisors, has been devoted to reducing the risk inherent in the financial system. One way they've done that, I mentioned about shadow banking, they've actually really tightened up regulation of shadow banking. If we were talking about this last year, we would be saying shadow banking's about to burst. We may well not see that now because the way they've been able to restrict. Some restrictions are fairly meaningless. So if you go into a bank to get a loan now, every bank should have a CCTV camera in the room in which the manager offers you the loan, and that CCTV camera should record him saying or her saying, I don't know, investments can go down as well as up or something like that, warning people not to be too risky. This is not terribly heavy regulation. There are other regulations that have been imposed upon banks, much tougher regulations, on speculative products, those that offer high yields that people gamble on. I'll have a bit of that, what do they call them, management investment products or something or other like that. There's also been tougher regulation that forces banks to be more honest about their off-balance sheet asset list, and many of them are underperforming and maybe have to be written down. There's a certain openness about these things. More scrutiny of local government investment plans. Local government is at the heart, as we'll see in a few minutes, at the heart of corruption and speculation, not controlled particularly firmly by the central state. China's more decentralised as a political system than is often implied by the fact that it's a single-party government. Local government and regional governments are up to their necks in all sorts of projects. So restrictions on finance have been imposed, and again the Financial Times, quote, "The days of easy monetary policy are over." So the Chinese state, and probably this is the advantage of authoritarian state capitalism, can probably resolve problems, or hope to resolve problems more firmly and successfully than liberal states. It doesn't face opposition in the same way from business groups or from the media and so on. Okay? So it's got some assets at its disposal, some real power resources. But it's got a profound dilemma. And I can't see that it can resolve this dilemma without threatening the whole basis of its rule in the long term. And I'll try to spend the rest of the time elaborating upon that. How long have I had, my lord?
So right, you're working about 15 minutes.
Right, I've got 18 written in the margin. Was I right? Okay. Tighter monetary restriction and firmer state control have fueled the fears of the corporate world. The very people they depend on to keep the Chinese miracle going are now worried that the state is over-restricting them. And what we've seen in the last year is a huge increase in the number of corporate defaults, giving in to debt, declaring themselves bankrupt, particularly in the financial sector. And it's this that has been behind the fall in the Shanghai Stock Exchange by about a quarter this year. Other commentators from the West have said the stock exchange has fallen because of the fears of the Trump trade war. But in China, the fear is debt and regulation. And the trade war arguments are marginal. In fact, the corporations whose stocks have fallen most are not trading corporations who might face restrictions from America. They're construction, finance, building materials, and that sort of thing. Internal firms who are saying the money is not going to be available in the same way that it was in the past. So a slowdown is feared, reinforced by the fact that infrastructure investment, a pillar of growth over the last decades, is at its slowest since 2012. All of this has been pushed from the top. Restrict, restrict, restrict. Take a gamble. Slow the economy down. Why? Because the fear is, amongst the Communist Party elite, that the problems facing the economy, the deepest problems and the triggers for potential deeper problems are in the financial sector. Therefore, they've moved firmly against the financial sector. And just to give you a little flavour, the corporate sector in the last 4 years has fled China periodically and then been forced to come back again. There's been an outrush of capital outflows. In 2016 alone, $28 billion left China every month. Now, in context, what the hell's 28 billion? It sounds quite big, but against the Chinese economy it might not be. But let's compare it with, for instance, EU firms' investment in China. The EU firms invested $8 billion in China in the year, but 28 billion Chinese dollars left every month. That gives you a sense of the scale of it. A significant capital outflow. Now, good, thanks. This takes us to very firmly into the politics of the situation. Will the ruling class relent when trouble starts? They have done in the past. They've restricted before, then the stock exchange bombs slightly, and they take out the restrictions and keep the economy ticking over. Will they do that this time? We don't know. But what we do know is that there is a growing authoritarianism at the political level. There is what the West talks frequently about this, about a growing personality cult around Xi Jinping. I think that's probably, I mean, there are aspects of that, the personal. He may well not like his rivals, and he may well have been behind the removal of the regional secretary of the Communist Party, Bo Xilai, in Chongqing a few years ago, who incidentally had virtually identical programme to him, but was a rival. There may be some personal aspects to this, but it seems to me the most important thing is that it's a collective response from the most far-sighted section of the Chinese ruling class about the sorts of problems they are facing and likely to face in the future. So, for instance, they've imprisoned radical lawyers. There's been a crackdown on the media. They've got an extra-territorial rendition programme, effectively, like the United States. And they apply pressure to countries that they're dealing with to round up, for instance, Muslims from Xinjiang in the west, Uyghurs, 200 were arrested in Egypt last year and faced repatriation to China, where, of course, they're dealt with as oppositionists and so on. So there's a definite sense of authoritarianism. The West media has focused on rather unimportant aspects to it, it seems to me. The fact that the constitution's been modified, so Xi Jinping or anybody can now remain in power for longer periods. They don't have to do just 2 terms or retire at the age of 65 or whatever the convention was that was built up around Deng Xiaoping, because Deng didn't want to return to Mao. That's been removed, so Xi Jinping could, like Putin, be in power for a very, very long time. There has been the development of a new supervisory commission within the leadership, a sort of inner circle of key allies of Xi Jinping imposing discipline on the party. Now, it's true that this has some personal and probably some unpleasant elements, but why are they doing it? And it seems to me it's not about the personal, nor can we say that the delegates who accepted all this, who voted for it at recent congresses, are simply doing it because of a personality cult. It seems to me there is let's just give you a flavour of that. When it was announced, Xi Jinping, it's not terribly imaginatively titled, Xi Jinping Thought on Socialism with Chinese Characteristics for a New Era. That's the title of his thought. You know, we used to say Marxism, Leninism, that was a bit of a mouthful, but this is even worse. It was voted at the 19th Congress in 2017. It got unanimous support from 2,287 delegates. That's a remarkable, it must be good thought if all of them unanimously. And it's the usual stuff. It's of very little consequence whatsoever. We want national development. The economy should be more environmentally friendly. Everybody should be happier. We need peace in the world. All that sort of stuff. It's really, it's trivial in a way. But it's being produced in umpteen books. There is a new red culture, a bit like the Mao cult, of reciting party songs, going into schools, pictures of Xi Jinping and all that sort of stuff. So what on earth is going on? And it seems to me the party has understood, or at least sections of it. There is a tension in the party around these issues because the leadership that has best understood the problem recognises that there is a deep cynicism towards the party because of its corruption. Not just corruption, but also wealth. The inequality in China. So Xi Jinping himself and his wife are worth hundreds of millions of dollars, apparently, according to Forbes. The New York Times a few years ago said that the then Prime Minister was worth $2.7 billion. Communism's a marvellous system for some people. More generally, local government, the local bureaucrats, are deeply mired in corruption. So when we get China defenders because of its communism, I was at a conference recently, Rob was there, and this figure comes out, whatever it is, 650 million people have been lifted out of poverty, or 700, it varies, it's often something and 50, it might be 850 next year. Now, we shouldn't sniff at it, we don't want people to live in poverty, but what it means is by the UN's measure, they go from $1 a day to over $1.50 a day. This is a marvellous thing, but it's not lifting people out of poverty in any sense that we would think of it. And it obscures the fact that there is this huge inequality in China. Okay? Deeply corrupt, and the corruption is centred on local and regional government. One mechanism, local authorities appropriate communal land and sell it to private developers, and they get a backhander. And the figures are absolutely colossal. Xi Jinping's begun to crack down on this, on an enormous scale, in fact. 200,000 officials have been taken to court, a further 400,000 punished via internal party mechanisms. But herein lies another dilemma, alienating a section of the party against you, creating your potential enemies. Okay? Hence the cult of the red culture. the singing of the anthem, singing of the party songs, and so on. The second big problem that explains Xi Jinping is he knows, I think, my guess is, his most important economic advisors know the model's running out of steam. That the 500 million people who've moved from rural to urban areas over the last 30 years and produced a colossal amount of surplus value to the benefit of the world system as a whole, they aren't there anymore. Indeed, China's now facing a population decline of about 5 million people per year. Wages are rising as corporations have to find labour, they're paying more. This is where our side comes in. And Simon Gilbert's piece, I think, was the best of the lot in that series in Socialist Review, on the emergence, we shouldn't overstate it, the emergence of a labour movement. That there's a growing confidence because labour workers are more stable. They are subject to this internal passport system. But the authorities and the corporations have begun to turn a blind eye as they try to hold on to labour. That gives them confidence. Even migrant workers are growing more confident as they become more established. And we've seen a series of strikes, particularly amongst teachers. It's very similar to here. Teachers whose strikes then generalise around a region to other towns, teachers in other towns. And as Simon points out, many of these strikers, and it's not just amongst white-collar workers, lots of industrial strikes over wages and unpaid wages, many people now have been on strike multiple times. And there is this emerging confidence. And as a consequence of that, it seems to me that the Communist Party is asserting, against all the evidence, we're a Marxist party and we're your party, so don't rock the boat, because they recognise the boat is being rocked. Conclusion, therefore. I've skipped rather a lot. The Chinese Communist Party faces enormous problems. I haven't touched upon the environmental problems. I've hardly mentioned the gender relations in China. And Sally Kincaid's article was excellent on that. The emergence through social media of an oppositional women's, not a movement's probably too strong, but definitely something's moving over there. Everybody knows the air and the water are filthy. What's the figure? 1% of China's urban population breathe air considered safe by EU standards. 85% of the river water in Shanghai is unsafe. People are very, very angry. We mustn't overstate it. China's rulers have got enormous reserves of power. They have a party with 88 million people in it for a start. Everybody in China, certainly in the urban area, knows somebody who's got on. But if the economy begins to slow down, and the figures are unequivocal on this, it's from 10% growth rates to 6.5%. Some authors say that's an overstatement by a factor of 2. Actually, real growth rate is more like 3. I don't know the answer to that. But if growth rate falters, the unwritten contract between the Chinese state and the people, we won't give you democracy, but we will give you growth, you just keep your gobs shut, that contract begins to be questioned on a scale that we've not yet seen, but we may see in the near future. So I'll leave you with that optimistic thought and open up for questions. Thanks.
Thanks very much for that. One of the achievements of the Chinese economy is to move the end of the Silk Road from Venice to Barking, which I think is a marvellous achievement personally, because now a train can run all the way from the east coast of China to Barking. God knows why Barking, to be honest, having worked there for 20 years. It's the last place on earth I'd like to visit. But more seriously, is the issue of the belt and braces attempt by the Chinese ruling class to expand outside the borders of China by a very sort of imperialistic, you know, we will lend money to Africa as long as we take the resources, we will set up ports all around the globe where our commerce can go. You didn't mention it, and I just wondered, in the context of the world economy, in the context of America, look like they're going in for big time sort of protectionism, will China fairly quickly, given all those trends, you know, when you say about the outflow of money from China, isn't a lot of that going into that sort of investment? Will they replace the American sort of century with their own century in not too distant future? And the second thing I want to say, I'm really glad you talked about the unrest in China, because that's the real hope. You know, when you saw, what, a couple of years ago, the things in Hong Kong, and when you see some of the footage on YouTube of strikes or people fighting back against land grabs, you know, sort of diggers being petrol bombed by opposition and stuff like that, I think there's fantastic hope for the future, I think, in China.
Any more hands?
The statistics are phenomenal. I thought it was very, very interesting talk. Just a couple of other little statistics I've come across. From 2010 to 2012, China produced more concrete than the USA did in the entire 20th century. Right? But, interestingly as well, a strike broke out amongst lorry drivers fairly recently. I don't know the details, but the suggestion was that that might spread to all the other lorry drivers in China, of which there are a mere 300 million. Now, this is interesting because there has been loads and loads of struggle. A lot of it is undocumented, but you can get access to it. But what I wanted to say as well is that there are still some people who believe that China is some communism or a form of socialism. I had a discussion recently with somebody of an orthodox communist tradition who said that it was now fantastic because the Communist Party has now got a cell in every single factory in China, a kind of unit, a party unit, and this is fantastic. And I said to him, will there be spies? I mean, there will be overseeing, you know, work productivity and stuff like that, and he was having none of it. And I think this sort of thing opens up something very important about the way that we analyse a society or an economy. For a lot of people on the left, the balance between whether or not something is socialist or not relates to the extent of private property on the one hand and state control on the other. And it's a very, very common thing, but I think it's mistaken, because the degree to which a society is socialist or communist or not is not along that track between private property and state control, but it is rather in the other direction, vertically, between whether or not the people who produce things and distribute things, make things in an organised society at the bottom have any control over what happens. And from that point of view, you can say very, very clearly that China is nowhere near being a communist society or a socialist society, but also that opens up the question as to whether or not any sort of state control, any sort of state direction, any sort of state planning, nationalisation or whatever, is necessarily socialist. And I think what we would want to say from our tradition is that that's not your starting point. The starting point is not the degree of state control. The starting point is the degree of workers' control, workers' self-organisation and workers' self-activity. And that's our kind of defining feature of whether or not something is socialist or communist.
Is there any more hands? Anybody else want to make a contribution?
I'm a teacher, so I'm going to have to test you. Who said that you have never had it so good in Britain? Harold Macmillan. He was a Tory. Think about what Theresa May, the Tory leader today, says: the market is broken. We have a problem in housing. So my argument here is that we have got to end, I thought, that there's the end of China theory. For 30 years or so, people have been saying something is going to happen to China because there's no democracy, it's going to collapse. But actually, my argument is we don't know how long it will continue the growth, but nevertheless, the high growth in living standards, there are so many good things we can say about China, and bad things, but that does not stop class struggle. Workers, all sections of civil society can easily come out and say, yeah, we've had it quite good, we want to continue having it so good. So in Britain, you know, one of the highest aspects of class struggle was in the 1960s, wasn't it? Over a period of long boom. So, secondly, how do we explain the importance of the state in Chinese development? There's no question. I advance an argument, quite simple. Chinese late capitalism walks in the footsteps of early Western capitalism. Everything we don't like about capitalism? Why does it have, state control? Why is it that all the arguments of conflict, of how the economy develops, expresses itself in the Communist Party, is because of the control of the state. And it needs the state control in order to fight off, if you like, Trump's imposition. Martin Wolf recently said that the trade war started by, by Trump was a form of the demands by Trump is a new form of unequal treaties. Now, what you do need is you need a state. Now, I don't want to praise it. Okay, we don't want to say that that is a good thing, right? But nevertheless, I think there are certain things I just want to finish off. And one final thing, yeah. The growth in China wasn't built only in the past 40 years. Which cat is black, which cat is white? Is it Mao or is it Deng? I just want to quote that Sidney Rittenberg, an American who knows China very well because he spent time in a Chinese prison and who came out recently, said that Deng grew on the backs of Mao. So in terms of the argument that he gave up, Xi Jinping today has given up this 2-term, someone actually said very cleverly, actually Xi Jinping is still the General Secretary of the Communist Party, commission of the military commission. So what is this signal? It is, ending 2 terms is not an issue if you were in Germany, were you? How many terms has Merkel had? But it's a signal to America that we are moving away from your model, okay? And certainly I think there will be, we're in turmoil times. So last thing I want to ask you is this. I think that in that certain test, China's foreign investment demonstrates to us that China has got no socialist interest. It is not for the interest of Chinese people. Secondly, the whole question, I think a genuine socialist government should not retaliate in terms of retaliatory tariffs. That hurts American workers, that hurts Chinese workers. So certain things like that tell us the character of a government is political nature.
Okay. Can I see some hands? Anybody? You can ask a question, it doesn't have to be a long contribution. So anybody just wants to ask Adrian anything?
Yeah, a quick question. I'd read or seen on TV that the tariffs from the United States may well affect other countries in the region more than China. Because China's production that involves China also is integrated. It is also integrated into other countries in the region. So any problems that China has, are they going to have knock-on effects in countries like Vietnam and South Korea and Indonesia and Malaysia and so on? I'd be interested in what you think about that.
Thank you. Okay. Can I see anybody else that'd like to make a contribution? Anyone else as well? We'll take 2 at a time.
Yes, I just wanted to ask a question about how Hong Kong fits into this, because I know there's been quite a lot of protests in Hong Kong and that China is trying to bring it more into line there, so I just wondered how that comes into the whole mix.
Anybody else want to come up? Someone else can answer the question. You want to leave it all up to Adrian? You feel you can?
Yeah, this is another question about protests, about the legacy of Tiananmen Square. The anniversary of Tiananmen Square comes up sort of regularly, and any news about it in China is suppressed and very difficult for anyone to talk about it. But the knowledge of Tiananmen Square must still be there, and there must be millions and millions of students. Students are over here in large numbers, able to talk about these things. Is there a student movement? Is there hope in the students?
Anybody else?
Yeah, really sorry, yet another question. So you sort of mentioned in passing the arguments around the environment in China, and I mean obviously the whole sort of image of China in terms of the environment seems to have undergone a real sort of change in the last 5 to 10 years or so, isn't it? I mean, 10 years ago you would talk about China in terms of the hugely polluting economy, all these statistics about building new coal-fired power stations, the stats you put about poor air quality in the urban areas, etc. And that's the sort of image we've always had of China. But now you've got this sort of slightly sort of dissonance going on, because China is now also presenting itself, isn't it, as a sort of at the cutting edge of new green technologies, etc. And certainly on the global stage, in terms of some of the rhetoric about future development of the environment, China is positioning itself and very much against Trump in terms of the Paris climate talks, etc. That sort of thing. So, and certainly there's been, at the same time, there's lots of stuff about the scale of pollution and the real problems in China. It seems to me that it's inevitable when you've gone through a situation of such rapid growth, and just the stats about things like concrete production, for example, and the level of infrastructure investment you've had, and the way in which that has impacted particularly on local communities in terms of developments. And Steve talked about sort of local struggles you get where people are fighting back to defend their local communities. That there must have been huge negative impact. So the question really is about whether this whole thing about China being the new sort of green economy in the future is just completely bogus, or whether there's any substance to it at all. Really, that's really the question.
Thank you, James. I've got two people here. Yes, come down.
Speak up, please.
Try and speak loud.
All right, I'm here from Australia, so we have a lot of discussion about China and Chinese politics and the international dynamics of things, so I'm kind of interested to hear a bit more about that. A couple of sort of the bigger things in Australian politics at the moment is, one, that we've had a massive period of long growth economically, basically propped up by Chinese investment in the minerals trade and whatever, a mining boom basically in Australia, which has now totally dropped off because Chinese investment has stopped and Chinese growth has slowed down. So it presents this dilemma for Australian capitalism, what you replace the mining boom with without that Chinese investment. So that's a big question. And we also have in the kind of positioning of Australian politics internationally, like this constant debate between, do we follow American imperialism or do we have to have a better relationship with China because of the dynamics of which, is China rising, is China going to become a greater power than the US? And I think at the moment Australian politics is more towards the United States, and there's a lot of kind of small examples of anti-Chinese racism really in Australia, about Chinese investment. There's a property boom as well in Australia where a lot of investment properties are being bought by Chinese investors, and then people are saying Australians can't afford houses because Chinese people are buying all of these new apartments and all of this, which is actually, when you look at the statistics about it, it's a very tiny proportion of who's buying investment properties in Australia are Chinese people, but it becomes this kind of racism. There's debates about the number of Chinese students that come into Australian universities in the higher education sector, which is one of the biggest industries in the country, and a real sort of balance, I guess, trying to be made about, well, if the Chinese government, and they've made noises when Australia says something about the possession of islands in the South China Sea, that kind of, the debate's going on about that. But if the Chinese government got too pissed off with Australia for its positioning in favour of the US, and start saying to students, which it has done at times, Australia is a dangerous and racist place to be as a Chinese student, that if all the students stopped coming to Australia, that would put a massive hole in the economy as well. So it's a real fine balancing act in terms of ruling class politics in Australia around the positioning towards China and what they should do. So we're kind of interested in that and the dynamics of like some of those international questions. And of course the North Korea stuff happening seems to be that China is the worst off out of the Trump deal with North Korea, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on that as well.
Just to raise the question we haven't talked about yet, which is the military dangers, I suppose, the dangers of war. involved in the current situation. I mean, when China was further down the league table of world economies, you know, the question of war with bigger economies was not on the table. But as they have risen up at the scale of world economies, they have quite reasonably, in capitalist terms, in terms of how states interact, they have attempted to address the imbalance. And for instance, are buying up second-hand, I understand, second-hand aircraft carriers from other countries, which they actually put aircraft on, unlike the ones that the UK still have. But, you know, they're quite aware of the fact that they need to rebalance and rebuild and face up to the threat posed by the US as they become more dominant on the world stage. And then the crucial question of the South China Seas, which is a very dangerous situation, where China is building up land masses, if you like, islands, creating islands, making use of the slightly undersea volcanic atolls and so on, concreting over them, more concrete, and then using broadcasting system, radio, etc., to warn off passing aircraft. In other words, you know, effectively extending the landmass of military-controlled China. It's a very dangerous situation because, if I remember the figure right, 40% of world trade, I think it is, 40% of world shipping goes through the South China Seas. So they're no longer prepared, quite reasonably, in capitalist terms, no longer prepared to accept the post-war situation that the US more or less rules the roost there. And there are numerous disputes about ownership of actual islands, not just the created ones. This isn't to say that, you know, war is on the horizon, not in the least. It's not in any way in the interest of either the Chinese ruling class or the US to pursue that. But when you see Trump posturing against North Korea, it's more than North Korea. You know, it's a very dangerous situation which can tip over. You know, these kind of jostling matches in the South China Seas could lead to an incident that could lead to something more serious. So it's not to say that war is on the horizon, not at all, but it's a very dangerous situation and underlines the inherent drive and risk of war that is involved in world capitalism and the battle between world economies.
Fu Wong is quite right that there was economic growth under the communist government that came into existence under Mao. But the model of state capitalism that Deng ultimately was responsible for initiating has proved remarkably successful, way beyond what is true of other state capitalist countries, which have seen stagnation and ultimately, in their own terms, collapse. Witness the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc. It is an incredibly successful, in its own terms, state capitalism. The figure I think that is quoted is 870 million people have been lifted out of poverty. And for those who believe that this isn't capitalist, they say, look, no capitalist country has succeeded in this way, so it can't be capitalist. Now, I don't think that's true, because, well, to use the old quote, this is a denial of the law of value on the basis of the law of value, at certain times, crucially, in order to ensure continued growth. But a continued growth that has been based upon an insertion into the world economy, dependent on exports, massive amounts of exports and payment for those exports, but combined with continuing very serious central state control through the Communist Party over the economy, where at times when things don't look so good, they can take steps, and the steps that are mentioned again by those who, if you like, believe that China is somehow fundamentally different from the rest of the world, have seen injection of investment in order to counteract cyclical downturns in the economy. But I think that Adrian has made an extremely important point about the way in which this economy is also internally, not just dependent on global trade, but internally a growth of the private sector and of sectors of the economy that are not as under the control of the state as they were in the past, the growth of the shadow banking sector and so on and so forth. And as he says, first of all, there's a tremendous dilemma going on, there's an argument going on. The central bank has one position based largely on Western economic analysis. Hyman Minsky was not a Marxist, after all. And others who are searching for answers to the looming problems and where they see as key the strengthening of Marxism, inverted commas, the strengthening of the Communist Party over the country in order to deal with the problems that they see in the future. I think this is a tremendous problem for them economically and politically. The future is uncertain, but the hope lies, as people have said already, in the growth of working class resistance to whatever the future holds.
Just to make three quick points. First, about shadow banking, which Adrian talked about, which the problem of debt didn't begin in 2028 or 2010. It goes right back almost to the beginning of growth capitalism in China in the 90s. You had dealing with the debt of the state companies, state-owned companies, and also speculative investment. You had arm's length organisations created by the banks from a very early time. And there were two occasions, 1995, I think, and 2005, where the state attempted to deal with this problem, but they didn't deal with it by actually pushing money into the problem. They just moved money around and hoped it would come out well, and it didn't. And once you get to the shadow banking, the thing becomes much bigger as a problem for the regime. The other 2 points are about after 2008 and when they're trying to stabilise the economy. I think there are two events. The first is the strikes in the car industry in 2010, which I don't think can be underestimated, because the speed from being a strike in one car component factory in Honda, it becomes hundreds and hundreds of factories affected, both owned by the Hondas and the multinationals, but also owned by subcontracting companies that produce parts for the car industry, involving hundreds of thousands of workers. And we're talking about an industry of 24 million cars a year they're producing. This is a central industry for the Chinese. And I think for Xi Jinping and the regime, they remember this, just like they remember Tiananmen Square in 1989. The last point is about transition, which came in 2012, I think, when Xi Jinping took over. I think, yes, it's an authoritarian regime, a dictatorship, but huge instability. When transitions took place in the Chinese regime, it's a huge instability, and particularly in that situation in 2012. First you had Bo Xilai, who was trying to muscle his way into becoming part of the top leadership and had to be forced aside. But also you have this whole situation in the transition where the old leadership becomes redundant. You think of the American president in the last year of his 4 years. There's a problem because they no longer have the authority that they did have. And Xi Jinping is looking at 2022, when his 10 years are up, and he's thinking, no, we can't have this. We have to go back to the Maoist idea of for life. You're there for life, because if it's every 10 years, this really is a huge instability, a situation where the economy is starting to flounder.
So I'll call Adrian to come.
Thanks, comrades. That was there was some fantastically interesting things said there. I'll start, not quite sequentially, but Steve's first point, Venice debarking. The idea of that as a film really appeals. But anyway, in my defence, we talked with the organiser about how we should talk about China this year. If you go on SWP TV on YouTube, all your questions are answered about one belt, one road, and China in Africa, and all the inter-imperial rivalry, the same as in the South China Sea. But I will repeat some of it, because last year I spoke about those sorts of matters. But it is striking. This $1 trillion worth of investment in 63 countries, I think it is, for China to link itself to rich markets, that means going through the Middle East, into Europe. The European Union is beginning to question China's role in Eastern Europe, because the way that the belts, it's not just barking, but Piraeus has been bought by the Chinese, and then motorways and railways are being built and so on, ostensibly for market purposes, but of course any ruling class recognises the security and aggressive aspects of installations of this nature. The second thing about that initiative, which ties in all these countries en route around the world for moving Chinese goods out and imports in, is I read just about a week ago, there is a vague discussions have started and references have been made to a Beijing-centric disputes resolution process. Now, great, what a mouthful that is. But if it were to come to pass that all the countries that have signed up to that initiative settle their disputes on the basis of Beijing-centric rules, what happens to the World Trade Organization and American-centric rules? These are quite big questions. We don't know any definitive answers yet. But all over the world, ruling classes are asking questions about not quite whose side are they on, but who do they gravitate towards? And in 10 years, that becomes the question of whose side they're on. They're venal. Money talks amongst ruling classes. So in the Australian comrade, that is exactly the argument. Politically and ideologically and security-wise, Australia remains close to the United States. But when its exports to America are 90 billion, these figures are not absolutely correct, but they are in an article I wrote, I just can't remember them exactly, but something of the order of, if they're $90 billion worth of exports to America, and $800 billion exports to Australia, how quickly will they think we need to be friendlier to China? These are the issues. Vietnam's another one. It seems to me America under Trump has overplayed its hand in one important respect. The belief that it is, because it's still the biggest economy in the world, naturally, whatever it does, we will keep quiet. Actually, most often our rulers will. But the Trans-Pacific Partnership, ripping up of that deal, seems to me to have been a big strategic blunder by Trump. It forced countries like Vietnam, which are not naturally predisposed towards China, having been at war with them in 1978, and the other countries in the rim of the South China Sea, and the comrade made exactly the right points about the South China Sea, the militarization of the South China Sea. And even though Vietnam has opened up Cam Ranh Bay, which for those of us of a certain vintage is memorable from the Vietnam War, it's where the Soviet fleets were there, where they launched against the Americans. The fact that America now uses Cam Ranh Bay indicates that Vietnam had moved closer to the United States. And guess what? Ripping up the Trans-Pacific Partnership, Vietnam concludes that it also has to move back towards a friendly position with China. That plays into China's hands. I agree with the point about North Korea, however. If there is a deal, and it's not yet clear that there's going to be a deal, already, Kim Jong-un has made certain noises, and in any case, it doesn't mean regime change in any short term. But it were there to be a deal and regime change, this would not be in China's interest from a strategic point of view. But its power resources in the South China Sea and the building of these militarized islands is very important. And it's not just venality and the fact that rulers around that region know which side their bread is buttered. There's also threats. A few years ago, Philippines complained about some of these islands. They're in disputed territories. Are they in the Philippines' waters? Are they in China's waters? And China, and they went to a dispute in the UN's Maritime Organization, and China stopped the import of high-quality bananas. Apparently Filipino bananas are marvellous, I don't know about this, but they stopped the import on health grounds. There was a beetle found in one of the boxes or something, right? When the Lotte supermarket, which is a South Korean supermarket, has a big chain of supermarkets in China, they sold some land to the South Korean state on which they built the missile radar thing that they bought from they're working with the United States, the THAAD, the anti-ballistic missile system. And all of Lotte's supermarkets were closed on health grounds. They're all a fire risk. Right? Until they play ball. The Filipinos ultimately play ball, then the bananas come back in, and so on. So there's both coercion and consent going on in China's relations with its neighbours. Anyway, it's all on SWP TV 2017. I won't say any more than that. Okay. TPP, right. How do I want to finish then? I vote James and the environment. In the environment piece in Socialist Review by Martin Empson, he made reference to that residual learning by rote of Marxism by Xi Jinping, that, as Engels said, you can't control nature, nature will come back to bite your hand or something like that. There is an understanding of this, and guess what they've done? Tried to control nature, not just with cement and dams. 43 of the world's biggest dams are in China. Colossal use of cement, which is environmentally very, very harmful. But it's causing all sorts of problems in underlying water tables, pollution and so on, driving people off the land, causing dissent and such like. And it remains overwhelmingly a fossil economy. It's quite ironic, because of global warming, and building dams and hydroelectric power is supposed to be addressing global warming, but because of global warming, the rains in Western China ceased last year. Therefore, the Three Gorge Dam water fell. It didn't produce enough electricity, so they imported a load of coal and oil, which produced the 3% increase in greenhouse gas emissions. You can't play with nature. And the deal for China, this is not about an environmental project, it's about continuing the consumerist dream, which is not an environmentally friendly dream, it seems to me. So they're caught on the horns of a dilemma. Of course, they're in the lead in certain technologies, these solar panels and so on. Colossally carbon intensive to produce them, but the end user reduces their electricity bill. Okay? This is not, as I say, an environmentally friendly model. Just one other thing about when we used to say when America sneezes, the rest of the world catches cold or something like that. You know, if GM don't do so well, then parts suppliers in Europe don't sell so many parts to America. Well, it seems to me nowadays, it's back to the Australia story, the comrade mentioning about the declining imports from exports from Australia to China. The same is true. The colossal fallout in Latin America as the Chinese boom has slowed down, notably in Argentina, soybeans, meat and so on, and in Brazil, with very, very serious repercussions politically and economically for those countries. That sort of thing could certainly happen. And our hope is the struggles. I just want to finish by saying something about struggles. Again, Martin's point about Martin Empson in his article. An academic environmentalist, Judith Shapiro, noted 127 mass incidents, strikes, struggles of various sorts. 5,000 concerned environmental issues. Protests are often successful. The state fears discontent spreading. There is hope. Big strikes, in fact, very often over environmental issues. But for those who think that somehow there's a residual socialism, or that there was ever a socialism about China, let's just finish with a couple of points about struggle. This is from Simon Gilbert's article about the working class in China. Agency workers at Volkswagen in a city in China have been campaigning for over a year for equal pay with directly paid employees for equal work. In other words, migrant workers want what everybody else gets. A legal obligation according to Chinese law, but it's not applied. Some of these agency workers have been working at the site for more than 10 years. This is not a socialist approach to labour relations, to have agency workers for 10 years. And I'll finish with this conference that I went to. And there are serious China scholars who have this view that China is somehow different, somehow socialist, for the reasons people said about state intervention in the economy. And therefore they see Xi Jinping as a return to Marx because he wants a more powerful state. Completely anathema to our approach. One of them said, the first duty of all revolutionaries, all socialists actually, she said, is to defend China against the all-out assault from the United States. Okay? An all-out assault involving massive foreign direct investment and opening up your markets to Chinese exports. It's not an all-out assault. Of course there's tensions, but there's also an assault, if you like, from China because it's a rivalrous situation. Our first response is not to defend China. It is to support protest movements like in Hong Kong. Tiananmen Square, there is a memory, but memory is not enough. I remember when Tiananmen Square took place, and Tony Cliff, the founding member of the SWP, did a public meeting in my branch in Hackney. And Honey Rosenberg and I said opposite questions. How can they put the genie back in the bottle after these workers have fought, and they'll have a memory? That was one, I can't remember whether that was me or Honey. And the other one was, they've been smashed, how will they recover? And Cliff's answer, I mean, Rob can see what the answer is, you're both right. Right? They have smashed in the short term, but the memory persists. The crucial thing is not just the memory, though, it's the confidence. And the confidence, it's not, class consciousness is nothing without class confidence. And class confidence is beginning to emerge. It's expressed itself in the Honda strike, was absolutely remarkable. I forget who said the Honda strike. The 2010 Honda strike, the All China Federation of Trade Unions sent thugs in to smash the pickets. That's what the state unions did. And the Honda workers won the right to elect their own officers. That is an enormous step forward in the China situation. There is an emerging confidence. And as socialists, we say that our first task is to defend the emergence of a movement to challenge the Chinese state, not to defend the Chinese state as those other Marxists, in many ways marvellous Marxists, but other Marxists are mistaken about China. For us, it's socialism from below, and I think there's real hope in the long term that that can be achieved in China.